Good morning. I'm Michael Amiridis, Chancellor of UIC, the University of Illinois, Chicago, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Urban Forum. I would like to begin by recognizing a few of the distinguished participants. We're honored that Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot was able to record a message for you today. We're also honored to have Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle serve as co-chair for the Urban Forum for yet another year. Many of you know that President Preckwinkle has been a very strong supporter of this forum over the years. I would also like to recognize Amanda Willams and Heather McGee, who will be your speakers today. And I want to extend my gratitude to all the members of the Board of Advisors for the UAC Urban Forum and to the panelists for participating in this virtual event. UAC has a long and well-documented history hosting annual events on important urban issues of the day, beginning with the Winter Forum in 1996 through the Richard J. Daley Urban Forums from 2005 to 2010. The concept and the format were revitalized in 2011 when the UAC Urban Forum in this form was established and continues today to serve its purpose: to bring together people from the community, the academy, nonprofits, government, and the private sector to discuss critical challenges and developments that our society faces. In previous years, the topics have ranged from housing and employment to transportation and autonomous vehicles. This year's title, Closing the Wealth Gap, could not be more pertinent. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted in a very profound way the disparities we are facing in our communities, especially our Black and Brown communities. Healthcare disparities, educational disparities, and of course, financial disparities. Last year, Mayor Lightfoot spoke at a full day's conference on poverty just weeks before the pandemic shut down the city. Since that time, the wealth gap has become even wider, and equity, especially racial equity and opportunity, have risen to the top of the news cycles and dominate local and national politics. I took a look at some of the statistics that we have all read or heard in the news over the past year, and the issue is deeply concerning. While the stock market is thriving, the collective work income of rank and file private sector employees declined by almost 3%. And over 76 million people lost their work between March of 2020 and January of 21. Over 18 million people were collecting unemployment in January of 2021, and nearly 100,000 small businesses have permanently closed. Almost 1 in 5 renters reported in January being behind in their rent. And low-wage workers, people of color, and women have suffered disproportionately in the combined medical and economic crisis that we faced. We have experienced these issues firsthand at UAC as well. Over the past year, we have received hundreds of emails and voice messages from students and families who have lost part of their income and who face challenges keeping up with their college expenses. Many of our students are children of immigrants and first in their families to attend college. They are in a uniquely vulnerable economic position. Wealth disparities will be one of the main issues driving the quality of life for a large percentage of Americans during the 21st century. We have learned from history that situations like the one that we experience are not sustainable, and I appreciate that this topic is the focus of this year's forum. I hope that some meaningful ideas will be the outcome of today's discussions, and I want to thank you all for participating in this process. Next, you will be hearing from Janet Smith, UAC professor in urban planning and policy and co-director of our Nathalie P. Vorhees Center for Neighborhood and Community Improvement.
Good morning. Welcome to the 2021 Urban Forum. I'm happy to see so many people here today. Of course, I wish we were in person so I could really see you all. While we do not have the ability to break bread together, I know that what follows will be great food for thought and inspiration for the challenging but good work ahead. Thank you, Chancellor Amiridis, for your opening remarks and for your support of this event, which is a hallmark of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. In addition to acknowledging the people who are part of this event, I'd like to also acknowledge the land on which the University of Illinois Chicago resides. While this meeting is virtual, we must remember that the University of Illinois at Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and Potawatomi. Purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. Today, we are taking on the complex topic of closing the wealth gap. We will focus on addressing the historical and structural barriers that have created the gap in the first place. This means dealing with the racial dynamics that shape social, economic, and political structures, the property ownership that affects wealth across different populations, and the geographic distribution of investment in public resources and land. Our speakers today, along with the complementary papers available on the Urban Forum website, all aim to help us address this collective problem so we can increase equity in our communities. You can find the agenda along with the bios of our speakers on the tabs on the screen. I'll get us started with some grounding information. The pandemic opened America's eyes to many disparities in our society and our cities. It also brought much needed attention to the long-term impact of racial, ethnic, and economic segregation across the country and in Chicago. Before COVID-19, awareness was growing about the rising levels of wealth concentration and economic segregation worldwide, and how both are interrelated in our growing inequality. Complicating this all are historical factors, including race, ethnicity, citizenship status, gender identity, and disability, among other things, which have been used to limit equal access to resources and opportunity. Reducing inequality requires understanding these highly institutionalized practices that are embedded in our culture and communities, and that contribute to and exacerbate differences in income and wealth. You may remember seeing these maps when our local public radio station, WBEZ, ran a story on the shrinking middle class in 2019. To mark the 40th anniversary of the Nathalie P. Vorhees Center for Neighborhood and Community Improvement, which I co-direct with Itai Zalalam, we launched a project called Who Can Live in Chicago? We mapped out change over time in the average individual income and found a tale of 3 cities. One that is growing wealthier and whiter and expanding, shown in blue, one that is growing poorer, shown in red, and a shrinking middle in beige. The red area is large, but it is also losing population. Besides being a majority of people of color, this is where most of Chicago's children live, where most of the people with disabilities live, where most of the people who work in essential services live. What we know about the expanding high-income areas is that they are tied to the growing professionalization of the labor force. This is not unique to Chicago or even the US, as it is happening around the world. In general, high-income professionals are moving to the center of urban regions, while poverty is being pushed out to the suburbs. Racism and classism in our policies and practice reinforce these patterns, and it has a cost, which we all pay through our taxes and lost opportunities. Segregation and income inequality affects how much money is circulated in our communities through consumer spending and property taxes, which can mean more or less funding for public goods and services like our schools. Communities also rely heavily on private sector investment. A recent report by the Urban Institute shows that, quote, market sources of investment, such as home mortgages, small business loans, and commercial real estate investment, flow disproportionately to white and low poverty neighborhoods. For many, this is not a surprising finding. In contrast, public and mission-driven actors, such as foundations, have invested 10 times more per household in high poverty neighborhoods than in low poverty neighborhoods, but still at 10 times less than the level of private sector investment outside of these communities. Interestingly, the research also showed that more investment did flow into communities of color, but only when they were gentrifying. These findings point to the tension of community investment and the need to always consider who benefits and at what price. As we know, income is different from wealth. Wealth is the value of everything a person or family owns. This includes tangible items such as jewelry, housing, cars, and other personal property. But it also includes financial assets, such as stocks and bonds, which can be traded for cash. Financial assets have really helped speed up wealth accumulation for a small percentage of our population in the past few decades, and especially during the pandemic. Billionaires like Jeff Bezos have increased their wealth by the billions. Meanwhile, his firm is fighting against its workers, unionizing, and seeking improvements to their working conditions and wages. And perhaps needless to say, but most of those workers are people of color, and many are older with no source of retirement. As we are now aware, thanks to our Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, there is a significant racial wealth gap, and it is growing. We should add to these charts the wealth gaps between men and women, people with disabilities and those without, and many others who are behind due to discrimination and lack of generational wealth. We should find this data alarming, considering that during this time period, people of color were trying to narrow the gap through different asset building strategies, including financial literacy, entrepreneurship, home ownership, and education. But just looking at the data on education, it's clear the racial wealth gap is not closing. In fact, it is likely doing the opposite, given how many college graduates are in debt from student loans. These data point to structural problems that are fueling the wealth gap, such as the severe decline in public higher education funding, which now requires students to borrow lots of money just to get a degree. Equity aims to close the wealth gap, but not just through investment. Equity is about giving more power to those who have less, so they can shape that investment. An important distinction I'd like us to keep in mind is that equality is not the same as equity. While equality strives to make sure all equal access to the same things, equity aims to give everyone what is needed to succeed. This includes removing the structural barriers that have created inequality in the first place. To do so, we need to focus on the root causes of wealth inequality and identify a path forward for creating a fairer and more just, sustainable economic and political system. One that will right our historical wrongs and prevent such injustices from occurring in the future. Clearly, this is no small task, but as we will hear today, efforts are underway that have the potential to make meaningful and sustained change happen. And to get us started, we have Amanda Willams, who will help us see some of the historical wrongs we need to address. Amanda is a Chicagoan, rooted with her family on the South Side. She is an artist, an architect, and an educator, a creative soul who strives to help us understand the complex ways race informs how we assign value to the spaces we occupy, and to see the openings and possibilities to change our ways. In advance, thank you, Amanda, for what I know will be a provocative presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Janet, for that amazing introduction and set up for what is going to be a wonderful convening, albeit virtually. I am so honored to be here and so honored to lend a few minutes of my thoughts to the overarching theme of today's presentations. As Janet said, I'm an artist. I'm also a lifelong Southside resident. I am from Auburn Gresham and now live in Bronzeville. I wanted to start us off today and give some visuals that we can tie in to some of the things that will come in as recurring themes. I want to start by saying today that this is the face of poverty, that poverty is a condition. Poor people are not a condition. This is an image from Jacob Lawrence in his Migration series in the 1940s that chronicled the move of Black Americans from the South seeking better economic opportunities in the North. It's a beautiful series, but I pulled this one in particular. They were very poor from the Migration series to really start to frame the way in which we imagine what poverty looks like and how that perpetuates the policies that are created to keep poverty in place. Impoverished human beings are the evidence of everyone else not trying hard enough, not thinking about the ways that health disparities and what we've seen from the pandemic in public health disparities are interconnected to all of the ways that we try to live our lives. Impoverished environments are the evidence of successful systemic policies of inequity and systems of inequality. From the denial of the promise of 40 acres and a mule to continuing disparities in farming subsidies for Black farmers, we see that land and the distribution of resources contributes to our inability to gain or maintain not even wealth, but sustainable livings. Poor people are the evidence of everyone else being unwilling to redistribute their own comfort. Impoverishing people is by design, both in communities of planning and architecture, as well as policy. Here is a very familiar image of Bertrand Goldberg and former Mayor Richard Daley, with others lording over images of the soon-to-be constructed at the time Hilliard homes. We understand that the people that get to make the decisions about how we access where we live and what we choose to do there are not congruent with the people who are actually going to be experiencing the spaces. Poor people are the evidence of nobody wanting to accept their fair share of discomfort. Nathalie Moore, a frequent co-conspirator on all things creative in Chicago, worked with me as we thought through ways that we could really achieve equity given the entrenched system of both racism and segregation. In her book, she stated that today it's impossible to desegregate family CHA public housing because the overwhelming number of CHA residents and applicants are Black. The federal court can't order minority families to white public housing sites because there are none. Just sit with that a moment as you remember that image of Bertrand Goldberg, the architect, and Richard Daley, the mayor, along with other officials, making determinations about which portions of the city would house the majority of public housing buildings and residents. If you're like me, you slightly panic when you see this image. Likely you haven't seen it since college or maybe even middle school. This is a formula for inverse proportionality. And I think it's important in a conversation of wealth that we talk about its relationship to the construction of poverty. Poverty is a necessary component of an ecosystem that aspires to unevenly hoard power and resources. This unsustainable system requires imbalance. The continued forcing of an imbalance that would correct itself were this all natural. We got to see this up close and firsthand in this past year when we had the confluence of both a public health crisis and a global reckoning with our ongoing racial crisis. Poverty is the deck stacked before the casino doors open and the slanting of the playing field. This is a house that was for sale last year in Chicago for $45 million. I've lived here my entire life. I am an architect, and I had no idea that there is real estate within the city limits that costs $45 million. Can you imagine that volume of money if redistributed across even a minuscule amount of the housing projects that are up for play right now in the city? How on earth can we imagine that there could be any kind of balance or closure of a wealth gap if we have such disparities in people's abilities to even live basic lives? There's a direct relationship, an inverse proportion to this document and the real estate that you've just seen. This is a document from the Chicago Historical Society's archives of the Auburn Park Property Restriction Association's restrictive covenant that basically says the neighborhood that I grew up in was not somewhere that I was allowed to live. And so if this is built in and baked into a document that precedes my existence, how am I ever going to achieve the possibility of the opulence or even the basic living conditions or experiences that I want if this is what the policies created? These are in direct relationship to each other. And it's not about how hard you work or about what neighborhood in the city you choose to live. If you Google the South Side, this is the result. If you Google the North Side, this is the result. Both are the result of long-held and carefully constructed narratives across multiple fields to create the story that somehow poverty and wealth are not related and that the individual has full control over their own destiny. For most of my life, but definitely the last few years, I've been really thinking about how realistically we can begin to close this gap and how can artists in particular be part of that equation. In thinking about this map of community settlements from the 1950s that uses color to delineate ethnic groups across the city, and this more well-known map, the Homeowners Loan Corporation residential security maps, that for almost every major American city deems real estate and the ability to secure a loan into 4 categories, of which grade 4, the 4th grade D, means that a loan can't be granted. And as we can see, and as we've seen over the last year, when you map these sorts of maps over any kind of other indicators, you see them almost point for point being the same zones. And so, how can we really change? I've thought about this question with Nathalie more. I've thought about this question with Tanika Johnson. And I realized that whether you fold Tanika's map or whether you shake the map that Nathalie and I created a few years ago, an acknowledgement of a need for uncomfortable disruption is a necessity. I was blown away when I learned that the dissimilarity index measures the relative separation or integration of groups across the city. Many of you listening probably know that basically 80% of Blacks or 80% of whites in Chicago would have to move for equal racial distribution. Who's giving up resources and who's willingly redistributing their ability to maintain their unearned power or to share that power? What if instead we could make it random? This is an image of a team taking the city and breaking it into those Homeowners Loan Corporation initial parcels and then shaking them to imagine a new future. I personally would like to live in the parcel that's floating in Lake Michigan. But here, in fact, is the parcel and the portion that I actually grew up in, D86. You can see it really small. And here's where the map sits today. in Mayor Lightfoot's office, hopefully as a daily reminder that what we constantly need is shaking up. The relationship between my parcel and that restrictive covenant is intractable, but it's one we have to continue to push through in order to close the gap. The gap was widened when in 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act and created a fund that would allow for the suburbs to thrive. In essence, the creation of the highway and the interstate system rolled out the red carpet for white flight. So I continue to make work that helps visualize for people the profound impact that such a seemingly innocuous infrastructural policy initiative can have on our daily lives and our experiences. This is an image from the Smart Museum in which we rolled the carpet through the museum and out the door. This is a moment where we also imagine what the richest exit or the most prosperous neighborhood and the exit from the highway system is, and what the least prosperous neighborhood is. Here's a beautiful advertisement for the Dixie Square Mall, which now doesn't exist any longer. And I think it's critical to see that the idea of mapping and the idea of space and territory were critical to selling the story of the kinds of places that we wanted to be. This is called Follow the Fairweather Roads, which was a line used in the advertisements. And it thinks about the fissures that have been created since its inception, and the idea that the areas north that were created to thrive continue to do so, and the areas south that were equally created to thrive no longer exist. And so when we think about ideas of erasure, and we think about the way that a piece of infrastructure or machinery that's used to either build or tear down always reflects the negative on the south side and always reflects the positive on the north side, we realize that this is baked into the system. The amazing work that was done on the study, The Plunder of Black Wealth in Chicago, and the findings of the lasting toll of predatory housing contracts on the system, conservatively estimates that the amount of Black families in Chicago that lost wealth because of predatory housing contracts during the 1950s and 1960s is $4 billion. I can't get my mind around that number still today, $4 billion. And that's conservatively. The amount of money recouped by poor people as a result of bills being signed into laws to close federal tax loopholes that benefit the wealthiest of Americans, $0 billion. And so this isn't even the suggestion of introducing new policy. This is talking about existing laws that are created to make sure that the recoup of resources that are owed is never there. So whether it's the dollar lot program and imagining what it might mean to allow residents to control their own destiny, and exploring that through art projects in which Inglewood residents gilded a room at the Museum of Contemporary Art and were the only folks allowed inside of that space during the course of that exhibition. And the pride even in that act, and the triggering of 50 other projects that come from the inspiration that anything is possible. What might happen? What if we had the resources? What if we could imagine another way? What if there was equal value placed on the real estate on both sides of the city? What if there was equal value placed on the people who occupy all of the city? What might that look like if we think about our experiences and our cultural heritages or traditions or realities about our built environment? What might it look like if we could use, even temporarily or symbolically, the colors or the materials that mean so much to the Black community on the South Side and apply that to the structures and the environments and the neighborhoods that have historically meant so much to us and could continue to mean so much to us, with resources available to maintain and uplift them. What if this wasn't always the fate of everything that is purposefully under-resourced? What color is poverty? It's redlining. It's white privilege. It's Negro removal. What if we had a modern day Chicago WPA? What would it look like for artists to transform from being chroniclers and documentarians of inequity to actually changing the game and writing the policy? This is obviously a famed image from Dorothea Lange when she was part of the FSA and WPA artist program sent to cover the Great Depression. This image is entrenched in most of our minds as this migrant mother moving to find better conditions for her children. It's an image that we can all relate to and we can feel empathy for. This is a modern day image of Florence Thompson, the woman featured in Migrant Mother, and her daughter surrounding her, who was able to go on from that moment and was able to find equity and was able to lead a good life in Modesto, California. I think it's important that we pay attention to the narratives that we tell and we think about whose narrative stayed the same since then and continues to be the same now. What if we empowered artists and empowered artists' vision to become policy and reality? What if artists like Maria Gaspar, Tanika Johnson, Edra Soto, Rashawn Ali Hendricks, Eve Ewing, Fahim Majid, Aram Han Cifuentes, Theaster Gates, Carrie James Marshall, Emmanuel Pratt, and me and my daughters were the stewards and the visionaries and the leaders for better futures to come? What if our profound understanding of not only the ways to show the narrative and to shape the story could also be things that shape our policy and our initiatives to move forward and bring equity for all? Thank you again so much for letting me take a few minutes of the program. And I am excited to hear the presentations and the growth that comes out of today's presentations. Thank you.